In this video, I will discuss what I think are the most badass passages from each of Beethoven's 9 symphonies. For the first symphony, I chose the end of the development section in the final fourth movement. I've always considered this symphony a tip of the hat to the greatest living symphonist at that time, Joseph Haydn. This is particularly apparent in the slow introduction of this movement that begins on the 5th scale degree and then whimsically teases the listener with growing fragments of the upward scale to introduce the main theme of the movement that begins with a now complete upward scale. Using a slow introduction to anticipate the thematic material of the fast exposition section is a trick Haydn was also very fond of, as you can hear in the opening movements of 3 of his late symphonies, number 90 in C major, number 98 in B-flat major, and the so-called drumroll symphony, number 103 in E-flat major. Note that Haydn's drumroll symphony was premiered in 1795. The same year during which Beethoven was making sketches for this final movement of his first symphony. Now back to Beethoven. Notice this important pink motif entering right after the main theme, combined with this slower upward scale. The exposition section concludes with an antiphonal or call and answer passage, featuring this green syncopated sforzato figure with the accent on the weak second eighth note of the measure. This is preceded by likely my favorite single note from the exposition section, this also rhythmically jarring accent on the weak beat of the measure. These sforzati and accents on weak beats are featured throughout this movement and the rest of the symphony, including later during my most badass passage. The development section now begins with the main theme alternating with the dotted figure that ended the exposition section, leading to this sudden outburst in the distant key of B-flat major, followed by the contrapuntal combination of the main theme with the pink motif from earlier. Some of you may remember this pink motif from my prior video about the finale of the Eroica Symphony that also uses the motif as a contrapuntal figure. One of you commented that this pink motif had also been used earlier by Haydn in the finale of his drumroll symphony, and even earlier by Mozart in the first movement of his K503 piano concerto in C major. In the Haydn example, it occurs as an answering counter-melody to the main theme played by the horns, but then becomes the dominant contrapuntal motif of the entire movement, combining with its inversion and later with a descending scale figure that resembles the main theme from the Beethoven finale. In the Mozart example, the motif first appears as a combination of the inverted and upright forms, and like in the Beethoven and Haydn examples, is also combined contrapuntally with a scale figure. Someone else pointed out the similar contrapuntal motif in the Domine Jesu portion of Mozart's Requiem that also appears in both upright and inverted forms. We've taken a scenic route, but we've finally arrived at the most badass passage, preceded by contrapuntal combinations of the main theme, first with its inversion, and then also with the syncopated green motif. The badass passage occurs when this intense figure from the exposition section repeats in the minor key, with trumpets and timpani adding to the intensity, leading to these offbeat sforzati from the winds and percussion, with imitative entries of the main theme played by the strings. The forcefulness of this passage now dwindles gracefully, introducing the quiet beginning of the recapitulation section. I couldn't choose just one passage from the Second Symphony, since the coda sections from the first and fourth movements are both equally badass. After a slow introduction, the lower strings introduce the main theme of the first movement. I've always loved this nimble 16th note interruption played by the first violins, and the similar passages that occur throughout the rest of the movement. The exposition section ends with this seemingly unimportant descending motif. The same motif ends the recapitulation section and repeats to begin the coda section. Entries of the main theme from the violins are now combined with this descending motif in the lower strings, this time with sforzati on the syncopated half note. The motif is then played twice as quickly in rhythmic diminution. The strings now play timid entries of the main theme, shouted down by fortissimo outbursts from the whole orchestra. These outbursts are now extended into an incredible build-up of tension, escalated by this rising chromatic scale in the bass. This strain culminates in the most badass moment of the coda, with these victorious suspensions, heard most prominently in the trumpet part. The movement now ends with one last triumphant entry of the main theme. The finale of the Second Symphony begins with one of Beethoven's most distinctive original themes, consisting of this grace note-like gesture, followed by this trilled figure, answered by this passage played by the first violins. Shortly after this, notice the grace note-like gesture played by the woodwinds and this red motif consisting of alternating neighboring notes. In the coda section, the orchestra decrescendos to this pianissimo section in the strings that is suddenly interrupted by this startling fortissimo German augmented sixth chord. Now the red motif returns, followed by an imitative passage featuring the grace note-like gesture. This builds to the most badass moment when most of the orchestra plays a fortissimo version of the red motif, with the first violins, timpani, and brass adding to the intensity by playing repeated notes. Harmonically, this passage is a secondary dominant chord, in this case a 5 of 4, resolving to the 4 chord in this measure. When the red passage repeats 4 measures later, it leads this time to another secondary dominant chord, the 5 of 2, which somehow makes the passage even more exhilarating the second time. The intensity of the 2 codas we just heard from Beethoven's Second Symphony foreshadow the revolutionary forcefulness of his Third Symphony, also known as the Eroica Symphony, composed only 1 to 2 years later. This energy is already present in the famous opening 2 chords that introduce the main theme played by the cellos. At this point, I have to mention one of my favorite YouTube videos that chronicles these iconic opening chords throughout the past century of recordings. Now listen to the beginning of the exposition section, noticing this green syncopated passage and this imitative blue figure that I mentioned in my last Beethoven video. Since I've already gone down the rabbit hole of comparisons, listen quickly to the first measures of the Intrada to one of Mozart's earliest operas, composed when he was only 12 years old. Returning to Beethoven, near the end of the exposition section comes the runner-up badass moment, when the entire orchestra plays 6 sforzato chords, in this case another secondary dominant, a 5-7 of 5. Listen to this famous moment introduced by the blue dotted motif from earlier. To me, this moment is even more spectacular when it returns in the recapitulation section, because of the following simple alterations. The 16th note passage played by the first violins has this time a measure of upward motion, and the heroic moment is now emphasized by a forceful roll from the timpani. The most badass moment I hinted at in my prior video, every fugal passage from the Beethoven Symphonies, occurs as the climax of a large crescendo in the development section. The crescendo begins with the fugal passage I described in the prior video. Recall the subjects of this double fugato are the blue dotted motif and the light red galloping motif, both from the exposition section. The music continues to intensify with loud sforzati that alternate between the blue dotted rhythm and the syncopated green leaps from the beginning of the movement. Notice that the horns and trumpets drop out for 6 measures, making it even more startlingly violent when they enter again, this time with the timpani. You'll notice that the majority of the badass moments in this video involve sforzati, trumpets, horns, and timpani. Of course, Haydn, Mozart, and many other earlier composers used all of these elements to great effect, but a hallmark of Beethoven's orchestral music is this new kind of intensity that is difficult for me to analyze or describe. Finally, the entire orchestra plays these sforzati chords that are rhythmically confusing, but that set up a consistent rhythmic pattern, only to be shattered in the next measure by these ferocious dissonant chords. These excruciating chords are my most badass moment of the symphony. The chord itself is an F major 7th chord, in this case acting as a Neapolitan 6th chord, with an added dissonant E natural. After this cataclysmic moment, and a quarter note's worth of dramatic silence, the strings play these staccato chords, decrescendoing to the mysterious entry of a completely new dance-like theme. This theme is the main focus of the remainder of the gargantuan development section, and of course returns in the coda. One more thing to point out before going on to the 4th Symphony. The transitional staccato chords we just heard have always reminded me of the famous opening of the Augurs of Spring dance from Stravinsky's Rite of Spring. While the Beethoven chords are not bitonal polychords, they do begin with a dissonant dominant minor 9th chord, and the overall orchestration of strings in their lower register and the aggressive staccato down bowing makes these passages sound very similar to me. The most badass moments of the Fourth Symphony occur during its final fourth movement. As I've stated before, the influence of Haydn is most apparent in Beethoven's First Symphony, but I've always considered the finale of the Fourth Symphony to be Beethoven's most Haydnesque single symphonic movement, because it employs so many of Haydn's classic humorous techniques. It's hard to overstate the influence of Haydn in Beethoven's music, and despite the rare but overhyped conflicts in their personal relationship, they had great respect for each other, and compositionally I consider them kindred spirits. The movement begins with this theme that's difficult to sing or whistle because it's unclear which parts are subordinate. The 16th note portion is split between the higher and lower instruments and is thematic at first, but eventually seems more accompanimental. The three subordinate opening chords also switch positions and become quasi-melodic. Notice this similar, difficult-to-sing opening theme from the finale of Haydn's 48th Symphony. The first badass moment occurs near the end of the exposition section, with this surprise fortissimo flat 6 chord, accentuated by a thunderous timpani roll, followed by these sforzati diminished chords with fragments of the original theme. The gravity of this moment instantly vanishes with this flippant syncopated answer from the first violins, followed by a second occurrence of the stern diminished chords and an even more hilarious syncopated answer. This juxtaposition of serious and humorous material enhances the comedic effect, much like the experience of walking into an air-conditioned building after having spent the whole day in oppressive heat. This, of course, was also one of Haydn's favorite tactics, and my favorite example from the opening movement of his 83rd Symphony in G minor is the extreme difference in character between the intense, stormy opening theme and the frivolous second theme that gave the symphony its nickname, the Hen, perhaps because it evokes clucking and pecking. Returning to Beethoven, the next badass moment comes at the end of the development section, introduced by this crescendo consisting of a repeated fragment of the main theme, accompanied by this persistent rhythm. This culminates in these intense tutti chords, followed again by sforzati, including fragments of the main theme. Much like before, Beethoven pivots from serious to humorous with one of his most beloved jokes, this premature entry of the main theme by the bassoon to begin the recapitulation section, entering one beat early with the same 4 notes that begin the theme. course, Beethoven had already pulled this stunt even more famously in the movement I was just discussing from the Eroica Symphony, with the horn's over-hasty false entry of the main theme, that of course consists of the tonic triad, while the violins are still playing this implied dominant seventh chord. This famous moment may have been inspired by the suspiciously similar moment in the opening movement of Haydn's Sixth Symphony, composed decades earlier. Listen first to the main theme played by the flute. Now listen to the moment just before the recapitulation section, when the horn plays the theme prematurely. I'm not sure if we know whether Beethoven had ever heard this symphony, but if not, then it's a startling coincidence given the identical instrumentation, the identical location in the formal scheme, and the very similar triadic nature of the theme itself. The final badass moment of Beethoven's Fourth occurs in the coda section, preceded by a reprise of the false entry joke, this time played by the clarinet, followed by an incredibly intense passage that grinds to a halt with this fermata. Before moving on to the Fifth Symphony, I have to mention one last Haydnesque gag that occurs at the very end of the coda. After a dramatic silence, the main theme appears one final time, but this time twice as slow or rhythmically augmented and fragmented by fermatas. One of Haydn's most famous humorous gags similarly fragments the main theme and occurs at the end of his Opus 33 No. 2 quartet, nicknamed The Joke because of this very moment in its coda section. The lively theme is played one last time, or so we think, by the first violin, followed by the unexpected feigned solemnity of this adagio passage that sounds like it's the end of the piece. After some silence, and in many live performances some scattered applause, the first violin starts playing the theme again, but this time with each phrase separated by a grand pause, similar to the fragmenting fermatas in the Beethoven. The final grand pause is 3 measures long and almost always elicits confused clapping before the final phrase. False endings that confuse the audience are quite common in Haydn's music, and two of my favorite examples occur at the ends of the finales of symphonies 90 in C major and 99 in E flat major. I'll let you listen to those on your own time since this video is meant to be about Beethoven. But before returning to Beethoven, one last hilarious gag from the coda of the finale of Haydn's Opus 64 No. 6 quartet in E flat major. First, listen to the main theme of the movement. The coda has a dramatic measure of rests, and then, just like in the Beethoven example, the instruments play the theme humorously twice as slowly, and in this case with an unexpected pompous dotted rhythm that was never present in the rest of the movement, and then returns to the normal pace. Now for a stream of consciousness tangent within a tangent. Listen quickly to the opening theme from the finale of Mozart's final great string quintet, K614 in E flat, and notice its similarity to the Haydn theme we just heard. They are both in the same key, they were both published within a year of each other, and Mozart's is just the inversion of Haydn's. The Fifth Symphony has many badass moments to choose from. In fact, I could make this video a lot shorter and just choose the immediately forceful, iconic opening bars, far more famous than even the opening chords of the Eroica Symphony. I briefly mentioned in my last Beethoven video that this rhythmic motif pervades the symphony, but it's particularly ever-present in this first movement, which has been admired as a paragon of thematic economy, much like the first movement of Haydn's Fifths Quartet, Opus 76 No. 2, so named because the entire movement is constructed around the opening falling fifths motif, and much like the first movement of Beethoven's own Opus 18 No. 1 Quartet, in which the opening motif is ubiquitous. This rhythmic motif from Beethoven's Fifth is popularly referred to as the Fate motif, because of a likely apocryphal story told by Beethoven's secretary and biographer, Anton Schindler, in which he claimed Beethoven had told him the motif represented fate knocking at the door. Listen quickly to what I think is the most badass moment from the first movement, the ferocious end of the coda section. And then I'm going to concentrate on an equally badass moment from the finale. The badass moment from the final fourth movement comes in the development section that's mostly based on two ideas from the exposition section. The first is this theme consisting of the same rhythmic fate motif we heard in prior movements, answered by its almost inversion combined with this second motif. The combination of these two motifs is explored ad nauseum in the development section, culminating in my most badass moment when the trombones enter with the red motif doubled by the bassoons and then also by the horns. Remember that this is Beethoven's first symphony that uses trombones. This leads to a three-part stretto of the red motif combined with a teal motif in the woodwinds, followed by fragmented imitative entries of both motifs that culminate in this triumphant long dominant pedal point. Remember that this is also the first of Beethoven's symphonies to include a piccolo, and in this section it plays entries of the Fate motif over the pedal point. This heroic passage is suddenly reduced to a single note in the first violins that introduces the surprise reappearance of the theme from the Scherzo third movement, also based on the Fate motif. Before moving on to the Sixth Symphony, I have to mention that the red motif from this movement has always reminded me of a similar motif from the finale of Mahler's First Symphony, since it has the same rhythm and its last note is often accentuated by a deafening timpani roll. Notice also the light green motif that follows in the Mahler movement that resembles another figure from the coda of the finale of Beethoven's Fifth. The most badass moments from the programmatic Sixth Symphony occur during the fourth movement, meant to represent a thunderstorm. Notice the orchestral techniques Beethoven uses to simulate the sound of a thunderstorm, including the tremolo passages that begin the movement, the loud timpani rolls, and the 4-against-5 pattern in the cellos and basses that produces a muddy sound effect in which pitch almost becomes irrelevant. Another famous orchestral depiction of a storm, from the prelude to Act 1 of Wagner's Die Walküre, uses similar techniques, including tremolos in the upper strings and a similar muddy quintuplet theme in the lower strings. Notice how the swells created by the dynamic markings evoke gusts of wind. Returning to Beethoven, we now hear similar growling, muddy sound effects from the lower strings that I imagine as distant thunder, interrupted by outbursts that I imagine as unexpected nearby thunderclaps. After a calmer interlude, the intensity returns with a passage that includes both extremely high piccolo notes and descending chromatic scales, depicting the whistling and howling of the wind. This leads to one final badass fortissimo chord that includes a thunderous timpani roll, tremolos in the upper strings, and the growling sound effects in the lower strings. Rossini also composed a famous musical depiction of a storm in his William Tell Overture. Notice in the most intense section that he also uses descending chromatic scales to depict the howling wind, including of course the piccolo, timpani rolls, this time with an added bass drum to imitate thunder, and tremolos from the violas. Notice also the badass answering passages from the trombones and bassoons. The most badass passage from the 7th Symphony occurs at the end of its final 4th movement. This is one of Beethoven's most relentlessly intense movements, opening with this fortissimo gesture, followed by this vertigo-inducing green theme. Notice that the opening gesture consists of a dominant E major chord, followed by a dominant 7th chord that doesn't resolve to the tonic until the gesture returns in the first ending. Shortly thereafter, the blue gesture alternates with this yellow fanfare-like theme, followed by imitative entries of the green theme. The The first of my most badass moments comes as the recapitulation section transitions to the coda, and consists of these incredibly forceful sforzati, eventually combined with a dizzying whirlwind of entries of the green theme. The intensity briefly subsides as the coda section begins with imitative entries of the green theme. These are eventually combined with a strangely repetitive chromatic bass line, forming a 38-measure-long crescendo to the final badass moment. Notice that this meandering bass line eventually settles on just alternating between E and D sharp, acting as a long dominant pedal point. Also note that when the tonic finally emphatically arrives, the lower strings continue playing the dominant pedal point. The yellow fanfare-like theme now returns, and its final scalar portion is now expanded into another crescendo, culminating in the badass moment when the dominant pedal point finally ends and the strings continue playing the yellow scales while the rest of the orchestra plays a secondary dominant 5/4 chord. This reminds me of the similar badass moment I already described from the finale of the Second Symphony. The Seventh Symphony now ends with statements of the green and blue motifs. If you enjoyed the prolonged crescendo based on a strange repetitive bass line in that brilliantly eccentric coda, you might also enjoy the very similar crescendo from the coda of the first movement. One of my favorite bits of Beethoven lore is that Carl Maria von Weber heard this coda from the first movement and said it was evidence that Beethoven was ripe for the madhouse. Unfortunately, this story is probably apocryphal, since it also came from Beethoven's secretary, Anton Schindler, and some historians believe he fabricated many of his accounts. Regardless, listen to this moment from the coda of the first movement. The most badass moment from the Eighth Symphony occurs during its final fourth movement, that begins with this pianissimo theme that dies down to triple piano before being rudely interrupted by this fortissimo, completely out of place C sharp. The orchestra now immediately repeats the theme fortissimo in its original F major, as if the C-sharp interruption had never occurred. The tonality now modulates to what we think will be the entry of the second theme in the expected dominant key of C major, but instead it first enters in A-flat major, before eventually entering a second time in C major. The badass moment occurs later in the movement with an even more unexpected and sudden key change than the one we just heard. The out-of-place fortissimo C-sharp outburst now returns, spelled as the enharmonic D-flat the first time, and this time it actually has a function, tonicizing the F-sharp minor entry of the original main theme. Now, in a passage that has always reminded me of an old vinyl record skipping, Beethoven repeats the same pattern 4 times, but during the third repetition, the key abruptly shifts down a half step to F major, emphasized by these relentless repeated Fs, played by the horns, trumpets, and timpani. Notice how the G sharp, that had been part of the previous F sharp minor scale, now becomes a chromatic non-chord tone this last time it's played in the new key of F major. This brilliant but brutish pounding of a square peg into a circular hole is one of my favorite moments in Beethoven's music. It leads to the satisfying return of the green theme in the tonic F major. Sudden modulations from a minor key to the major key a half step below were certainly uncommon in Beethoven's time, and are much easier to find in late Romantic chromaticism, like in this example from Schönberg's Verklärte Nacht, that shifts from E-flat minor to D major to introduce this lush new D major theme played by the first cello. Sadly, to our modern ears, the novelty of this particular key relationship has worn off, thanks to innumerable mass-produced superhero movies with the mass-produced scores that sometimes rely almost entirely on this exact relationship. To avoid copyright claims, I'll just play the relationship with the terrible sound of synthesized strings to make it more authentic. The badass moments I chose from the Ninth Symphony are from the first movement, that has one of the most badass openings of any piece of music. It begins quietly but forebodingly with open fifths, and like we saw in the finales of Symphonies 1 and 7, it begins on a dominant chord, minus in this case the third scale degree. The strings now quietly enter with this dotted orange motif, also outlining an open fifth. The orchestra gradually crescendos as more and more instruments enter with the sustained fifths, and as the orange motifs intensify as the temporal distance between them shortens. This culminates in the tutti statement of the orange motif in the tonic D minor, followed by the important blue motif I discussed in my last Beethoven video. One of my favorite parts of this opening crescendo is the early anticipation of the tonic played by the bassoons and the third and fourth horns. Now listen to this badass opening. Many years ago there was a brilliant TV ad, I think for some type of luxury car, that was set to these opening bars of Beethoven's Ninth Symphony. It kept alternating between showing a man dressed in a tux driving the car and a concert hall with the orchestra playing Beethoven. As the music intensified toward the fortissimo tutti, it showed the man exit the car and enter the concert hall just in time to play the first timpani entrance. I suppose the point of the ad was that the car would get you to where you needed to be on time. For some reason I can't find any trace of this ad on the internet, but if one of you finds it, please let the rest of us know in the comments. Anyway, this opening is so badass that later famous composers couldn't resist imitating it, as you can hear at the beginning of Macbeth, one of Richard Strauss's less famous tone poems. Notice that it's in the same key, begins with the same gradually intensifying dominant open fifths, and that it uses the same dotted orange motif. The most badass moment of the Ninth Symphony is the beginning of the recapitulation section of this movement. The development section ends and builds up to this moment with a crescendo involving multiple statements of the blue motif, leading to one of Beethoven's most intense orchestral passages. Notice the open fifths, similar to how the movement began, but this time played fortissimo by most of the orchestra, with the timpani joining in right from the beginning with its ferocious rolls. However, the bassoons and lower strings actually play the third scale degree this time, and it's surprisingly raised to an F sharp, making this a first inversion major tonic chord. Since the F sharp only appears in the lowest registers, it allows the overall chord to retain some of the expansive, elemental open fifth sound that began the movement. I've always been amazed by this moment, and I think it might be the most apocalyptic and terrifying major chord I've ever heard. The orange dotted motif now reappears as expected, answered by feverish, shrieking replies from the whole orchestra. Now, after one of my favorite German augmented sixth chords, D minor is emphatically re-established by statements of the orange motif, followed by statements of the blue motif. However, notice that Beethoven sneaks in another F sharp, continuing to confuse us with modal ambiguity. Notice also that the timpanist has sustained this tonic role throughout the passage so far, but that it now becomes a tonic pedal point as the harmonies change around it. Watch my 2 previous Bruckner videos for 2 examples of Bruckner similarly using the timpani to play long sustained pedal points. The forcefulness of this passage now dies down, and this more relaxing green theme is reintroduced. It's interesting that when this material from the first movement returns in the introduction of the finale, it also appears as a first inversion major chord. I've always thought this was a brilliant choice, since it appears as a vignette between 2 recitativo passages, and a first inversion major chord is one of the most common chords in recitativo passages. Now listen to this moment from the introduction of the finale. I'm concluding this video with one last badass moment from the first movement, occurring at the end of its coda. Notice another example of a strange, repetitive, crescendoing chromatic bass line, much like those I discussed from the 7th Symphony. This builds to one last ferociously badass passage, leading to final statements of the orange motif and the blue motif to conclude perhaps Beethoven's most badass symphonic movement,